This evening I'd like to share with you some thoughts regarding our role in dealing with many of the problems in society, the environment around us, and in the world. If you look at the problems in the world, we find that the problems are so deep-seated, so widespread, so serious, that we begin to wonder whether in the past 3,000 or 5,000 years, humanity has really progressed in directions that are significant to us. For example, in the 20th century, there had been more people who have been killed in wars and armed conflict than all the centuries combined. The phenomenon of terrorism, for example, is something which we see in a form unheard of before. Before we used to hear about political terrorism, where they would target military targets or government targets, but never civilians. But in the 20th century, we find indiscriminate killing of men, women, and children of whatever race or religion in public squares and subways, with gases, with bombs, and other forms of weapons. If we look into the environment, we are facing such a problem that has never been faced before by humanity in terms of degradation, in terms of global warming. When we look at religious divisiveness, ethnic problems, and many other areas, we face the possibility of catastrophic proportions that has never been considered before in previous centuries. And one begins to wonder whether we are nearer any solution to this or not. Whether our civilization and advancement offers to us any kind of doorway towards the eventual resolution of all these global problems. So this evening I'd like to share with you some slides that would invite us to explore about what perhaps our role may be in this global situation. In looking at this, we asked ourselves, since we cannot be passive, what can you and I do? And what is the role of the Theosophical Society in this? In the Theosophical literature, there is, among the Mahatma letters, there is one letter which I think is the most significant, the most important, and it is called the Letter of the Mahachohan. The Mahachohan is the teacher of the two Mahatmas who inspired the founding of the Theosophical Society. And he dictated a letter addressed to Sinet, and it contains a capsule of the vision of the work of the Theosophical Society. That this letter has often been called a charter of the Theosophical Society, and it's worth studying, reading, and rereading. In that letter, it has, among its many significant statements, it has this statement. It says, "To be true, religion and philosophy must offer the solution of every problem." This sentence has often been in my mind ever since I've read this letter, that it must offer the solution of every problem. That the world is in such a bad condition morally is a conclusive evidence that none of its religions and philosophies, those of the civilized races less than any other, have ever possessed the truth. To these, there must be somewhere a consistent solution. And if our doctrines will show their competence to offer it, if our doctrines will offer their competence to offer it, then the world will be the first one to confess that must be the true philosophy, the true religion, the true light which gives truth and nothing but the truth. In view of the origin of this letter, I take each of these words quite seriously and look into what it implies in terms of our participation as members of the Theosophical Society, as individuals. So, this evening I'd like to look into the matter that if we were going to get involved, are there principles that perhaps may help us in our actions, in our programs, towards somehow helping in the solution to these widespread problems. In looking at this, there are 5 facets which I'd like to explore with you in the offering of solutions to these, whether it is in our own small areas of work or in a larger global area of work of the Theosophical Society. Let me go through them briefly first. The first one is the need to search for root causes whenever we are dealing or searching for the solution to problems. The second is the importance of considering scale in the solution of problems. The third is the importance of the power of ideas in looking for solutions. The fourth is the significance of the spheres, what is called the spheres of influence. And the fifth is the critical role of adherence to root principles. Let me go through each one of these principles. The search for root causes. Most solutions that we see in the world today, whether it is done by NGOs or by the government, they are dealing with obvious manifestations of a problem. Thus, they are symptomatic. For example, hunger is symptomatic. Violence is also symptomatic. But society has to devote a lot of funds for this in order to stop such outbursts, such symptomatic outbursts. And how do we do so? We must send the police to stop violence. We must feed the hungry people. For political and public opinion reasons, and for reasons of urgency, they demand immediate attention. And the public is also allayed when the symptoms disappear. However, when the root causes remain, the same problems such as hunger and violence persist and they reappear. Thus, there is a need to look for more permanent solutions to these problems. This means that we must go beyond the symptoms, and this means solving the root causes even if the solutions will not be appreciated immediately by the public. Let me just give an example of the relevance of this principle when it comes to peace work. When there are eruptions of violence, one of the immediate things that governments do is to send soldiers or policemen. And of course, that doesn't really solve the problem, because if hostilities are still existing, then this violence will reappear. Or we send negotiators to end the hostilities so that at least there will be a lull in these hostilities. But what happens is that whether in a small scale or global scale, there would be a so-called Cold War or nonviolent hostilities, yet the parties are still antagonistic towards each other. Given the opportunities and the power, they will do something again to become dominant in this confrontation. If we go deeper, we may encourage cultural exchanges, people exchanges that will bring about better understanding and goodwill, that would try to end hostilities and ill will among groups of people. But that's still not sufficient. We have to go into a deeper transformation, such as when there are changes in the social structure, the presence of democracy rather than totalitarianism, freedom, tolerance, acceptance of other cultures, or policies of peacefulness and so on, then this state of peacefulness would go much longer. But the root of it must be human transformation, based on a way of life, a philosophy that are basically non-violent, so that even if there are provocations, like what is happening in Tibet, the party, or at least one party, does not seek to retaliate and start a new round of violence. This then would be, in the example of peace, an approach to go deeper into the roots of violence and solving it on a permanent basis. Allow me to share with you our own limited experience in the Philippines when we started helping in solving some of the social problems we have and we had in the Philippines. This started in about 1980s when, for some economic reasons, there was severe hunger and malnutrition in the Philippines. And so we started our project. We started our project in the Philippines by, again, dealing with the symptoms, which is to help solve malnutrition. I remember one time I went to a clinic, a government clinic, and there was a 7-year-old boy who was brought to the clinic, and he could not even walk because he was so severely malnourished. He was only half the normal weight of a normal child. And when I touched his buttocks, I did not feel any flesh. It was just bones. And this boy was not only severely malnourished, but severely retarded due to malnutrition. And so we felt the urgency to do something about it. We had a very extensive program. We even asked the United Nations to send us volunteers from other countries in order to help us in this program, and we did this for many years. We had mother seminars, but we realized that the problem was not simply about nutrition or poverty. It was also about the values, the attitudes of the mothers. In other words, even a poor family can make a child healthy by knowing how to prepare nutritious food, inexpensive, nutritious food. And then, therefore, we went into an economic self-reliance and livelihood program directed towards the mothers, the parents, particularly the mothers. But again, we found that that was not sufficient. When the mothers had enough money, we discovered that they were having new problems. Before, they did not have money, and their problem was poverty, malnutrition, and other things. But when they had more money because of the microcredit program that we were introducing, they had now something to quarrel about, and that was money. And we realized that just by providing them the economic means to survive is not also the ultimate solution. We must go deeper. So we went into the family development program, including giving scholarship to their children, establishing schools, and helping public education sector in order to provide better educational opportunity for children. But in the very end, we find that we must go into the individual. So long as the individual has misperceptions about things in life, ways of life, values, attitudes, then these things would reappear, and economic power can even cause more problems that are sometimes more evil than before. And hence, we decided that we must work on individual transformation on a root basis. Now, dealing with symptoms is short-term, and we can often see the results immediately, and hence it's both, sometimes it looks rewarding and fulfilling, and you see the results when you deal with symptoms, because people recognize it. You'll even be interviewed about it. It will appear in the papers. You'll have photographs in the papers, and it looks as if there is a very positive result. However, if we deal with root causes, we may find that it takes much longer and people don't see the results because you go deeper into the roots. And there are therefore some difficulties when we are trying to solve on the level of root causes, because since they are not immediately visible, we are not really sure whether they are effective. For this reason, it is important that we must also ensure that the solutions that we offer are effective even if we don't see them immediately. Sometimes such solutions may take 1 or 2 generations before they really take effect. Like planting a tree, we don't see the seed of a tree, we don't see the tree full grown tomorrow. It may take 20 years or 30 years. And how do we know that we are planting the right tree? We must look at the seed and see whether the right seed is being planted. And hence, we need to ensure through analysis and study that the root solutions are truly effective. So in looking at the effectivity of root solutions, we have to ask several kinds of whys. There are surface whys and there are root whys. For example, if we look at violence in society, we may ask, why is there violence in society? Maybe it's because of the media. Maybe it's because of the educational system, the competitive system. Or maybe there are 10 or 20 other different reasons. But when we look into those intermediate causes, we must further ask why. If media fosters violence, then why do they do so? Is it because producers get more advertising with violent films? And if so, why is it that it's more profitable? Then we go deeper and deeper into the root cause until we go into the beginning of the evolution of that thing which leads to social violence. Sociologists have said that in order to look into root causes, we must ask at least 5 layers of whys before we go reasonably deeply into root causes. And hence, when we look into our offered solutions, let us ask multiple levels of whys. In implementing root solutions, we must also consider a second factor, and this is the importance of scale. For example, a root solution done in one city may actually be a temporary solution if the effect can be undone by national factors. For example, if there's a drug problem in one city and you solve it, but you don't solve it in the neighboring city, then eventually when you become more lax, then this problem will infect the same city. If you have tuberculosis in one town and then you only solve it in that town, but you don't solve it elsewhere, then your effort for 10 years or 20 years will be negated because the people in your town will still be infected by people outside of the town. The same thing with bird flu, SARS, and so on. And hence, this is true also on a larger scale. A solution done in one country may be negated by external factors or global factors. For example, if we try to reduce carbon emission or carbon dioxide emission in Australia, but other countries don't, we will still share the same atmosphere, the same environmental problem, and hence the solution to this carbon emission problem must be global and cannot be localized. An enduring solution, therefore, must take into account the scale of the solution such that external factors will no longer be able to undo the results achieved. And for this reason, it is important that there must be synergy of simultaneous efforts worldwide which will make it more effective than isolated efforts that may be defeated by external factors. Let me mention a few examples. There are many examples, but a few comes to my mind. Bangladesh in South and Southeast Asia is one of the poorest economies in this area. And there had been in the world in the Philippines, Indonesia, and other countries, efforts on microcredit, lending out capital to poor people and then guiding them to start a business and so on. The Theosophical Order of Service in the Philippines went into this for many years ourselves. But Grameen Bank did not stop on a small scale. They went on a nationwide scale such that they reached a certain, what do you call this, a certain critical mass, such that they became a significant factor in the level of economic progress of Bangladesh, something which other microcredit programs were not able to do. In fact, Grameen Bank was so successful, not only in terms of lending to other people, but also in encouraging sanitation, education, literacy among the poor people. Today, it owns the biggest cell phone company in Bangladesh, and this for the purpose of giving opportunities for farmers and rural people to know the prices of their commodities and products so that they would have the optimum prices when they sell these products. And thus, the effect of Grameen Bank in Bangladesh on a national scale was such that Professor Yunus and the Grameen Bank were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, if I'm not mistaken, last year for the significant contribution to Bangladesh as an entire country. Let me give another example, that of the Rotary Club and polio. In 1986, as you know, polio is infectious, and when you have it in one country, it can affect other countries. So in 1986, the WHO decided that polio must be eradicated worldwide. And the Rotary Club decided to take on this as a global project, so that practically every Rotary Club in the world would take this as a project. And hence, by the year 2002, I think, polio has been practically eradicated in the world except for 2 countries where it remains endemic. And so the effort is still being done so that polio gets eradicated in these 2 countries, and then polio will cease as a global disease in all parts of the world. So this is an example of the power of scale. If WHO or Rotary Club did it just on one country and one country basis, then this polio problem will continue and continue for generations and generations still. Global warming. It has been recognized that this cannot be done by any single country, neither the biggest economies in the world nor the isolated efforts of individual concerned countries, but must be global. And hence, an example of Kyoto Protocol, wherein which countries agreed to reduce the carbon emission in their respective countries, despite the fact that some significant or important countries like the US did not want to sign it. But there was now this global concern about controlling of carbon emission, such that in many countries today, they are achieving the goals of Kyoto Protocol. And there had been mechanisms which enable the more developed and industrialized countries to have a balance between carbon emission control programs in developing countries, even if they themselves would start certain new industries that would produce new carbon dioxide emissions. Another example is WHO and the SARS outbreak. If this was not done on a global scale, it would have still been with us today. Now, for us in the Theosophical Society, TOS, Indo-Pacific Federation, what is it that we can do together on a scale in which there would be sufficient, significant root impact on 1 or 2 or 3 major global problems that we can all agree on, we hold each other's hands and do something together? This is something that we must look into. And even if we just start with 2 countries, 3 countries, until more and more theosophical countries would join hands together to do something about it, it will be a significant start. We may not see the total globalization of such effort until, 5 or 10 years from now, but somehow, if we want to be a significant factor in the solution to these global problems, we must start, no matter how small we start, a scale that we start in. The third area is the power of ideas. When we take actions in order to help solve problems, we can do some physical programs, physical actions, or specific projects. But we will notice that these specific physical projects will tend to have a limited impact or a localized impact. Influencing the minds of people tends to have a deeper impact that lead to self-perpetuating actions. And this means influencing the values and the culture of society. Let me use a diagram to illustrate this. In this diagram, you'll find that if I do one action here, there may be, let's say, 3 results. But if I undergo a change as an individual, I as an individual implementer, then all my actions will now result in a certain direction, and all my specific actions will have an effect based on the change within me. And if there are policies, institutions, and organizations that would tend to help change individual implementers, then the effect of this would be far greater compared to a specific action. If there is change in culture and belief in society that would lead to these kinds of changes, then the effect would be far greater. And when there are changes in human life, in ways of life, which would affect the culture, then there would be far greater effect in society than specific actions. Let me pick up a few examples in history to illustrate the importance of root ideas, ways of living, and their effect in society. The first one that immediately came to my mind when I was preparing this talk was that of Marxism. We may say that Marxism was not very long-lived. It's now on its way out. However, I'm quite impressed. It struck me very much how much the idea of a single person who was just writing in the British Library and in the descriptions of Marx's biography, I had the impression that he was writing in the dark, feeling very miserable, just writing day in and day out. This book, Das Kapital, and other works. He was just an individual who was producing an idea. And communism is not even a new idea. You'll find it in Plato's Republic. You'll find it in early Christianity. But he presented it as an idea in a novel approach with a new angle, such that it was picked up by Lenin, and it took over Russia, and then it now spread around the world, so that more than half of the world at a certain period was under communist influence. However, it had its own weaknesses, since it violated one of the 5 things that we're going to mention here, which is the violation of root principles, the use of violence in the achievement of its goals. And thus, after 2 or so generations, people found that the idea in itself could not work, and hence today there are just only 2 countries remaining that are still under this influence, and all the rest, like China and Russia, have abandoned it. In other words, the idea did not work. But during the time that it did draw the fascination of many leaders in the world, it was changing the history, the geography, the political relationship of the entire world. And that was simply because one person planted an idea sometime at the turn of the century. Another example, nonviolent social change. And the person who planted one such idea was a relatively unknown person, although many of us are familiar with him, but to the world, very few people know him, Henry David Thoreau. And he wrote just a very short piece of work on this called Civil Disobedience. But this small piece of work had an influence that Thoreau did not even imagine. He did it on his own small scale during his lifetime. At that time, the United States was at war with Spain or Mexico, and Thoreau did not approve of it, and hence he refused to pay the poll taxes. And because he refused to pay, he was brought to jail. And the story that goes like this, that Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was a very good friend of his, went to visit him in prison. And when he saw Henry David Thoreau in prison, Ralph Waldo Emerson asked, "Henry, what are you doing in there?" And Henry David Thoreau answered, "Ralph, what are you doing out there?" This was his example of civil disobedience. He was willing to go to jail on a nonviolent basis to protest some kind of social injustice that he perceived. And later, this idea was picked up by Tolstoy, by Gandhi, and many other countries in the world had adopted this approach. Tibet and the Philippines was one of the beneficiaries of this idea. As you know, in 1986, during the time of Ferdinand Marcos and Imelda, the Philippines underwent a peaceful, what is called People's Revolution, without bloodshed at all. And the government changed within 4 days' time in this nonviolent way. I myself got involved here in this street, large street called EDSA, where hundreds of thousands of people were there, and tanks could not cross it because people were blocking it. And I remember there was an old woman who was in a wheelchair, and she asked that her wheelchair and she be placed in front of the tanks. And I think she was half blind or blind, and she said she's willing to die and be crushed over by the tanks. But if she can, she would like to stop the tanks. And indeed, she sat there and waited for the tanks to come. But none of the tanks dared to run over her. And no gunshots were fired, no cannons were fired, because the people were willing to face the soldiers. And then what the many ladies did was to bring flowers and put the flowers on the nozzle of the guns. And it became a very touching scene when the soldiers had just to sit down and just talk with the people and no longer engage in battle. This is one of the significant moments in Philippine history, but I think also in world history. So one idea from Thoreau was picked up by a few people and by many leaders in the world. And Aung Suu Kyi in Burma is still facing this struggle in a peaceful way. A fourth area is what we would call the spheres of influence. The Theosophical Society, the Theosophical Order of Service, and many NGOs and institutions are relatively small compared to the vastness and depths of human and social problems. By ourselves, we cannot fully reach out to our intended audiences or the people we'd like to help. How many are we in the theosophical world? About 30,000. What's the population of the world? It's about 6 billion. We're just a tiny drop in this huge ocean of people. How do we expect to reach out to 6 billion people if we want to help solve the problems of the globe? The only way that one can think of is to create what the Mahatma Kuthumi in the Mahatma letter said, the creation of spheres of influence. What are such spheres of influence? If you imagine those small dots on the screen as people around the world, billions and billions of them, and the TS or TOS or Perth Lodge or Rotary would represent a small circle having a membership of so many hundreds of people or even thousands of people. If the TS or TOS undertake a program like a publication that reaches out to hundreds or thousands of people, then even if these people are not members of the Theosophical Society, they come under a sphere of influence when we introduce, for example, a root idea, an influential idea, then they come under the sphere of influence of such publication, and despite the small number of a group of workers, then the effect will be much larger than when we depend on one-on-one contact with the audience. If we, for example, go into some kind of advocacy, and the mode of advocacy is effective, then we reach more and more people. I have in mind a few organizations which I think are not very large. For example, Greenpeace is one of them, PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, yet their circle of influence, their sphere of influence is worldwide, despite what I think is a small number of people involved in them. And we can go into education, whether it's establishing our own school or introducing educational ideas, like what Maria Montessori did or what Rudolf Steiner did. Maria Montessori started her own school and wrote several books, and now all over the world there are so many Montessori schools that are not under her son or her organization, the Montessori International, and yet the ideas are now all over the world. The same with Waldorf School of Steiner. Then if we go into, for example, peace work, the same thing. And each of these areas of influence will further create their own subspheres of influence with their own circles and so on. And thus, even with a limited number of people, we would be able to optimize the influence of worthwhile ideas. The fifth one is the importance, the pivotal importance of adherence to root principles. Whatever it is that we advocate, its ultimate end must not contradict root principles or values, such as love, kindness, harmony, unity, happiness, altruism, truthfulness, and sincerity. As I mentioned earlier, this, I believe, is one of the causes of failure of Marxism. It violated one of these, and that is they practiced the use of violence in order to attain its ends. Whenever we make use of methods or temporary aims that violate such principles, then we are probably doing harm. And when our advocacy violates such principles, we also reach an impassable ceiling beyond which we cannot go, we cannot be effective. Let me give some examples about how some noble efforts, well-meaning efforts, can sometimes produce such collateral harm. Now, let's talk about economic progress, which is the general goal of countries or economies. We normally measure national progress through gross national product, or GNP. And what does this mean? It means that there must be more people who should consume things, wider consumerism. It means that companies must have higher sales targets. There must be tourism promotion, greater use of natural resources, even if there are other things. For example, there are undue wastages of materials like throwaway styrofoam boxes, plastic spoons, fork, bags, and so on. In Thailand, for example, which for many years has advocated, had promoted a very strong tourism industry, some studies show that one reason why people go to this country for tourism is because of child prostitution. They even go by plane loads for this. The government was aware of this, but could not stop it because it will affect tourism industry. Now here was a very serious dilemma about gross national product and the welfare of their own population, their own children. In Goa, for example, Goa is a city, former Portuguese colony in western India. There is a famous tourist destination in India. In order to promote tourism in Goa, what the government did, at least in that area, was to promote the putting up of golf courses, swimming pools, many chains of hotels, and usually they are invested in by people outside of Goa. And when you put up a golf course, you have to water the golf course every day to maintain the greenness of the lawn. When you have swimming pools, you have to make available water. And what happens was that Goa ran out of natural water, such that the population sometimes have to walk miles and miles before they can go and able to get drinking water. And this tourist industry, the hotels, the profits go to where? Does it go to Goa? Not necessarily. They go to where the investors are, and probably they're invested elsewhere. So here was a conflict between the so-called tourism industry of Goa and its own people. And when they chose tourism industry, the people suffered. It may also entail the destruction or depletion of valuable natural resources and have other collateral harm in a country. An example is Nauru in the Pacific, in which the whole island was practically a deposit of phosphate. These are the droppings of bats. And because it was needed for fertilizers and so on, they kept on exporting it, and adopted the ways of life of consumerism. And as a result, Nauru today has one of the highest incidences of diabetes among countries. And this natural resource that they had is something which is not, you cannot produce it again. It is not, what do you call it? Renewable. It's not renewable. It's something that has been put there by nature for hundreds of thousands of years, probably. There are also harmful things like emissions that are produced by the encouragement of industries in a certain place. I often visited the south of China in Fujian province, and there is a group of towns in that southern China which have been very backward and at very low income. It's a fishing industry for many generations. So while Shanghai and Beijing have been progressing, they remain economically backward. So what did they do? They allowed the establishment of industries which are already being rejected in other places. These are the dyeing industry for the dyeing of cloths. And as you know, when you use dye, chemicals, they are very strong pollutants, and they can go to the ground and go to the rivers. And for what purpose? In order to generate employment and economic progress in those cities. Today they have severe problem with this one because it's a fishing village, and these polluting materials go to the sea, and who are the ones affected? They themselves are affected. And yet they could not dismantle this anymore because there are thousands of people dependent on this dyeing industry for their livelihood and income. So when we measure progress in terms of gross national product, we have to see whether this is really what we want, or we must have a balance between a sufficient level of economic stability and other things which are as important as money and economics. Compared with a country such as Bhutan, which is perhaps the only country in the world which has a different national goal. Their national goal is gross national happiness. Believe it or not, it's their official goal. And anything which would be harmful to this goal will not be promoted or allowed by the government. It is a Buddhist country, by the way. Its national growth, its economic growth is regulated. It's not being encouraged to grow so fast. Its tourism is limited. It's limited only to the number of tourist agencies in Bhutan is limited to, I think, 23 and no more. And its agency is limited to accept and arrange for so many number of tourists per year and no more. They don't want television programs from other countries. They don't want this fast food chains in their countries and so on. And we begin to wonder whether they're actually wiser than the rest of us in trying to pursue something which is in the long term beneficial to its population as compared to trying to catch up with the economic progress of the rest of the world. There are many other examples. I'll just briefly go through some of them. Microcredit. The Theosophical Order of Service started a microcredit program in the Philippines for many years. And many of the beneficiaries would be asked what businesses they can go into that they're familiar with. And we get a lot of requests to sell cigarettes and alcohol. And we say no, that they must look for other forms of livelihood other than this. And we tell them why. It's because by trying to help themselves, they're also harming other people. But they say that's the easiest thing to sell because a lot of people buy these things. But still we say no. We realize that if we want to help, we better help without producing new harmful things in society. In education, for example, when we establish schools in the Philippines, we realize that many schools adopt programs and aims, goals that have harmful effects on children. For example, the use of competition and fear in nurturing children, in bringing up children. And as a result, when they grow up, they become competitive. They try to outdo each other, and when they become businessmen, they can sometimes become ruthless competitors, rather than trying to seek the general welfare of society. When there is fear in education, they develop insecurity, low self-esteem. So we teach them math or English or history, but the method of teaching can often harm more than what they gain in terms of academic knowledge. And hence, if we go into education, can we do so without producing collateral harm in the children through methodologies that will produce some dysfunctional facets of their personality when they grow up? Sometimes they are taught things that they need to unlearn, such as violent approaches to resolving conflicts through either punishment or shouting, through the very examples of the teachers. Suppose you want to promote nutrition, then we have to ensure that the dietary practice that we are promoting would be something that is really helpful. I mention this because in the world today, there are many famous nutritional programs, and they have become multi-million industries in the United States and other countries. But eventually, it's found that they produce a lot of harm. By trying to lose weight, the diet may produce many other forms of sickness. And we begin to see whether we are really helping the people in helping them to lose weight. We are introducing new other kinds of sicknesses or diseases in their lives. So when we now look into offering solutions, it is therefore quite important to look into these 5 facets in offering solutions. The first one is the importance of looking for root causes and root solutions and not just intermediate solutions. The second one is that if we do something, can we do it at a scale that will be hard to undo in the future? Which means that we probably have to synergize if we do something together in the Theosophical Society. Then we have to realize that more than specific projects or programs, the power of ideas can make people change in a more fundamental way than simply institutional or individual programs that we may implement. Then, considering that we are small in terms of numbers, we must look into the spheres of influence in promoting whatever it is that we'd like to do, provided that we adhere to root values and principles and not violate them. Because if indeed what we do is influential, then we are going to be influential in a harmful way. And it's something that I believe we don't want to do. Once we have laid the right foundations, once we have decided on the right means, then whatever it is that we decide to do, we must not be afraid to dream distant dreams, even if we don't see the results in our lifetime. We must not be afraid to make mistakes. I don't even believe that when we have the right principles as the foundation of what we do, that we will really make mistakes. It will only be a mistake in terms of effectiveness, but not in terms of the goal or the methods. And we must not even be afraid to fail, for whenever we plant the right seeds, when we do the right action, there is no failure. The results may be slow and small, but it will not be a wrong fruit. Because when the right seed is planted, surely the right fruit will be harvested. Our task then is to choose the right seeds and nurture it with dedication, patience, and intensity, doing the best we can. And that's the best that we can do, giving of our best. And we will discover that in so doing, we have unknown co-workers around the world who are working for the dawn of a new day, a new world, founded on the right ways of living. And when we have done so, then at least we'll feel comforted by the fact that we have contributed our small share in making this world a better place to live in. Good evening to all.